Thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to give. I suppose this is my inaugural lecture for the new College of Humanities. And I'll start by saying the carnivores can rest easy. That's actually not my topic today. On the other hand, there may be other implications of what I'm saying that you may not all be so comfortable with. What I want to do is, in a way, you could see this talk as a promotional lecture for studying ethics, which I know some of you are already doing and some of you perhaps will be doing. But I want to do that by taking some ethical questions and showing how they lead to philosophical questions, taking some ethical issues, I guess I should say, things that you can see are questions, and then seeing how, if you push a little bit deeper into them, you inevitably get into philosophical questions of the sort that philosophers of the past have discussed. All right. This is a street in the city of Foshan in China, a street with sort of market stalls around it. This is a closed-circuit video that just happened to be running at this particular time, and later, because of what it showed, it was shown on television in China, which is, and you can download it from the internet if you want to look at it all. Well, I'll describe it and then I'll tell you how to Google it if you want to do that at some stage. So here's what happens if I were able to show this video, and I wasn't going to show it all. This white van drives down here, and from somewhere out here, a small child, maybe 2 or 3 years old, a girl called Wang Yu, wanders into the street and is hit by the van. The van drives on, the van doesn't stop after hitting the child, and the child is lying here on the road. A few seconds pass, somebody comes around on a bicycle on a path that would have run over the child, clearly notices the child, steers around the child and continues. A few more seconds pass, another person walks down the street, also notices the child, walks around the child and continues. That's about as much as I would have shown you of the video. But if you Google Foshan, which is spelled F-O-S-H-A-N, and something like child hit by van, you'll probably get the whole thing. I think in total, I haven't counted myself, but in total I think about 17 people walked down the street while the child was lying there, and also another van ran past and actually ran over the child again. After that, a woman comes around, a person who is cleaning the street or picking up recyclables, something like that, it said, notices the child, sort of raises the alarm. The mother, who is somewhere around but obviously is not aware of where her child was, comes out and of course is horrified. And the child, Wang Yu, was taken to hospital then, but she was too severely injured and she died. That's why we have that next slide with what I hope is an obvious question. Is the death of a child a bad thing? We're not talking about some imaginary science fiction circumstances, or we're not talking about a child who is dying from a painful condition that is incurable. We're talking about a more or less random child who wanders out into the path of a van. And I take it we would all think that that is a bad thing, in fact a very bad thing, that a child like that should be killed. Certainly that was the reaction when the video was shown in China. There was a huge reaction of shock, horror, outrage, and people essentially saying, what kind of a country have we become that something like this can happen, that people can walk past a child who is just lying there on the street, probably to most of them visibly injured or in some way anyway, at least clearly in a dangerous position to be lying out in the street. And there were some repercussions. I think the driver of the van was charged with offences, I suppose, not stopping after an accident, and there were attempts to charge some of the other people who walked around her. I'm not sure what happened to that. But that's not quite my interest in this situation. I wanted to raise a number of ethical issues, of which this is the first one. I take it there wasn't any dissent to the idea that the death of this child is a bad thing. Anybody wants to say they're not sure about this? You can say so. If not, let's move on. There's another question that is perhaps a little more people may disagree with. So the question is, did the people who walked past this child do something wrong? Now, if the answer to this second question that I've raised, whether we're responsible only for what we do or also for what we omit to do, if the answer to that is we're only responsible for what we do, then, I mean, depending on exactly how we interpret, obviously, that distinction and what we do, but it's arguable that these people did nothing wrong. They did not push the child in the way of the van. They weren't driving a van carelessly. Let's leave the van driver out of it, all right? I'm talking about the people who walked or cycled past the child, who saw the child but did not stop to help the child. So they might argue that there was nothing that they had done that was wrong because we're only responsible for what we do rather than what we omit to do, and what they did, they might say, is to walk down the street, to continue on their business, which is a legitimate thing to do. They may have walked down that street hundreds of times before, and nobody would have suggested that it raised any moral questions. And there is a philosophical position that perhaps could support that answer. That position is known as libertarianism. That position basically says that I'm free to do what I want to do as long as I do not violate the rights of anyone else. They, of course, should not violate my rights. So, on that view, you need to have a theory of rights in order to say what it is that you're free to do when you're free to do whatever you like to do as long as you don't violate anyone else's rights. But the conception of rights that libertarians, I should say, apply to this theory is essentially rights against. That is, we all have rights against others not to be infringed upon in some way. I have a right against you that you should not punch me. That is, unless I invite you by going into a boxing ring with you or something like that. I have a right to the property that I have legitimately come to. So I have my wallet here, let's say, with some money that I've earned, and I have a right to that property. I have a right against you to steal that property, against your attempt to steal that property. But I have no right to assistance from you. I have no right to aid from you. That doesn't mean that it would be wrong for you to give it to me. Maybe a libertarian might even say, well, a nice, generous person would do it. But the libertarian would also say, I'm not doing anything wrong. Nobody is violating any obligations if they walk past the child on the road. So that's the view that would say here, we're responsible only for what we do and not for what we omit to do. But I would guess that most of you here would probably think that that's not the case. I would guess that most of you would think that the people who walked past this child did something that was wrong. Not only something that shows that they weren't the nicest, most caring people around, but that they actually did something wrong. Maybe let me check whether I'm correct in that assumption. Okay, we have 1, 2 brave people. It's fine to be, we remember a line in the life of Brian, we're all individuals. I'm not. I'm not, exactly, you know it. You know it. Good. So it's good to have some individuals who are prepared to say, well, I think that that's true, maybe these people are not the nicest people in the world, but they didn't do anything wrong. And that's definitely a position that is there and that some people might defend. So I'm not going to go exactly into that debate at the moment, although some things that I say may be relevant to that debate. But perhaps in later on in discussion we'll get to why I think that that isn't the best ethical position to hold. But let me go on to a third question, which will take us a little further. So, the majority of you anyway thought that the people who walked around that child actually did something wrong, that they were not doing what would be ethically defensible. And most of us like to think that we don't do things that are seriously wrong, that, well, you know, we may not think that we're saints or perfect or anything like that. We think that we try and live a reasonably ethical life. And I imagine that most of you, when I described what happened, most of you thought, oh, I wouldn't have done that. If I was walking down the street and I saw a small child lying in the road, clearly in danger of getting run over again, and quite, you know, I would sort of try and find out what's the matter, who's looking after this child, why is this child here? And so I would have been a better person than those people who walked past the child. But I'm putting up this question because I want to draw attention to the fact that we feel that about a situation in which the child is in front of us, there on the street. And while that situation is psychologically salient, that idea that there's this child we see in front of us that we can help here, and the situation of people far away from us on the other side of the world perhaps, is not so psychologically compelling in the same way. We need to ask ethical questions about, is that really a relevant difference? Is the fact that a child is far away, a child I could help, whose life may be in danger if I don't help, is that ethically important? So, in acknowledging that it's psychologically significant and it makes a difference, I'm suggesting a division between what affects us emotionally or psychologically and what we can see as being ethically relevant. So let me say a little bit more about that distinction, which clearly raises a number of questions. There have been some interesting studies in the last few years of the psychological ways in which distance and identity affects people. So, for example, in one experiment, psychologists invited students in to take part in a short experiment in psychology for which they would earn $15. And they were not really told anything more about it, the experiment, than that. So students came in, they were given a questionnaire to fill in, which took them a while, and when they completed, they handed in the questionnaire, and I think their assumption was that this was the experiment, to get them to answer this questionnaire, and so the person at the desk then said thank you, accepted the questionnaire, and paid them $15. At which point the real experiment began, because the group was divided in half on a randomized basis, and all of them were given some information, which began by saying, our department supports a different charity each month. Here's some information about the charity we're supporting this month. I wonder if you'd like to give anything towards it. And of course they now just had $15 in small notes in their hand. And the information differed in the following ways. Half of them received information that said something like, in Malawi, thousands of children go to bed hungry every night. You can help them by donating to the name of the charity. And the other half got a similar piece of paper, but it had a picture of a young girl, an African girl, and it said, this is Rokia. She's 7 years old. She lives in Malawi. She often goes to bed hungry. You can help Rokia by donating to the charity. The result was, as you can perhaps guess from what I was saying, that far more students gave when they were given the photo and the name of the child than gave when they were given the general information about the situation in Malawi. That's, if you think about this, if you sort of try and think about rationally what was going on, this is a bit puzzling, because presumably none of these students really thought that their money was going to Rokia. I mean, they didn't really think that the department was collecting money for a whole month to give to one girl so that she would become significantly richer than any of the other children in her village, and the rest of them would all just be left where they were. So it's not that there was some sort of rational process going on, rather they just found it more emotionally appealing to have an identifiable person who they were helping. And I think that that's an important aspect in why we think in that situation in Foshan, where you could see the child, or at least if the video had run you would have been able to see the child, and the people on the street obviously could see the child. You know, we feel that there's something wrong with them not helping. And yet we know that there are many children in need of assistance. And we don't feel in anything like the same way that there's something wrong with us not helping them. So that's just one example. I'll perhaps give you some other examples in a moment of the significance of the psychology. But the question is, does it really mean that somehow we are off the hook in ethical terms because we don't see the child? Let's look at just a couple of relevant facts here. So this is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Foundation's most recent report on child mortality. It starts out with what it takes to be good news. If you can't read it from there, it's at the first line there is, more children across the world survive their 5th birthday now than ever before, according to a new UNICEF report released on the 13th of September. So that's great. More children get to survive to their 5th birthday. The next paragraph says, the total estimated number of under 5 deaths fell from nearly 12 million in 1990 to 6.9 million in 2011. So that's also good news. We know that the world's population actually increased significantly from 1990 to 2011. So not only did the absolute numbers fall, cut almost in half in that 20-year or so period, but as a proportion of the world's children, it must have fallen by more than half. So that's good news. Until you think about this figure, it's still, or at least it was still at the end of 2011, 6.9 million children dying before they reach their 5th birthday. And most of these deaths, the report goes on to tell us, are from avoidable or curable poverty-related diseases. So it's not as if the majority of these children are dying from things like cancer that we don't know how to cure. small number of them are, but it's a tiny number. Most of them are dying from things like malaria, which we can largely prevent with the use of insecticide-treated bed nets, and if we can't prevent it, it is treatable, but it is largely treatable. A large number of them die from diarrhea, which we can prevent by providing safe drinking water, and where we can't prevent it, we can cure it actually very inexpensively with a rehydrating solution, but the problem there is to get it to all of those kids who need it. In other words, to distribute it throughout the rural areas of impoverished nations, and to give training to people in each village so they know how to use it. A number still die from measles, although one of the reasons for this fall, this last line here says the new figures show that it's possible to radically reduce child deaths in affordable ways by including vaccines, and then it goes on to list some other things. So among the vaccines, measles, for example, has significantly fallen in recent years. Used to be well over 1 million. It's now, I think on the most recent figures I saw, under 500,000. And that's partly due to efforts to immunise more children against measles. So it's an example of the way we can make a difference, but we're still not making a difference to these 6.9 million, or hopefully the trend has continued to be downwards, so maybe in 2012 we haven't got the figures, maybe it was 6.6 million or something, I don't know, and maybe in 2013 it's on course to be 6.4 million. But at 6.9 million, it was still 19,000 children dying every day from avoidable poverty-related diseases. So before we get too complacent about the fact that, well, we wouldn't have been like those people in China walking around the child in the street, little Wang Yu, think about whether we're walking around, not literally but metaphorically, whether we're walking around many of these 6.9 million children. Because there are things we can do. I've mentioned malaria, still one of the biggest killers. This is the website of the Against Malaria Foundation, which says that more than 1 million people die each year, and about 70% of them are children under 5, so maybe 700,000 of those deaths perhaps are from malaria. And malaria is preventable. And here's how it's preventable. This blue thing wrapped in plastic is a bed net, an insecticide-treated, long-lasting bed net. This is a child who has, whose family have just been donated one. So there is good research that shows that distributing bed nets and giving people a little bit of training in how to use them and the importance of using them reduces malaria. And this is something that we can provide. The organisation that I just showed you, this one, the Against Malaria Foundation, has been evaluated by a charity evaluator called GiveWell, which you can find at givewell.org, which is by far the most rigorous charity evaluator out there. If you look at this little pie chart, it's actually reviewed hundreds of charities. It's currently recommending just 3 of them, of which the Against Malaria Foundation is one. Now, some people get the wrong impression from that fact. That is, some people may go away with the idea, do you know that 99% of charities are worthless? They'll say. Well, that's not what GiveWell is saying. What GiveWell is saying, of 99% of those charities that they've examined, is we have not been able to attain sufficient confidence from the information they have supplied to us that they are highly effective organisations in reducing global poverty. They may be highly effective organisations. My guess is that a number of them are also highly effective organisations. It's just that it's very difficult and sometimes costly to do the kind of evaluations that GiveWell requires. So, for example, with malaria, with distributing bed nets, there are people who have done randomised controlled trials That's the gold standard, as it is with drugs. When somebody produces a new drug that they think can cure a disease, the gold standard for working out if it's really efficacious before the National Health Service or other bodies will agree to provide this on the National Health Service is to test the drug in a randomized trial against either the standard treatment, if there is a standard treatment, or against the placebo, if there is no standard treatment. And only if it comes out as clearly having cured more people or led to better quality of life will it be supported. So GiveWell basically wants this kind of standard proof. Not absolutely in all cases, but typically that's what it's looking for. And that's quite hard to do. It's quite costly to do, because it means that, for example here, you would have to go to double the number of villages that you're going to distribute bed nets to. You would have to find the levels of malaria and the numbers of children who are dying of malaria in double the number of villages that you're going to give bed nets to. You would then have to randomly select half of those villages, give bed nets only to those half. But in all of the villages follow the rates of malaria and the rates of child deaths. And then after you've done that for a couple of years, you could then say whether distributing bed nets works or doesn't work. And it has been done, and the answer is that it does work. It is effective. So it's possible for GiveWell to say, well, we think that's a highly effective charity, and they can work out how much it costs to distribute these nets and how many lives you're going to save. If you have organizations that do very different things, that, for example, try to empower populations or empower women to have more say in their lives. For example, Oxfam some few years ago went into Mozambique to help women's groups to change the laws of inheritance, which at that time in Mozambique meant that if a married man died, all of his property went to his family. So his wife, with whom he might have been farming the land for 20 or 30 years, becomes a pauper upon his death, or has to throw herself upon the generosity of her husband's family in order to continue living. Well, that law was changed because of the kind of, well, in part because of the kind of work Oxfam did with local women's groups in Mozambique. You can't do a controlled trial of that, clearly. It's a one-off thing. So that's one of the reasons why, for instance, Oxfam is not on that GiveWell list. It just does too many different things, too diverse, they can't evaluate it. But the reason that was a bit of a sidetrack, the reason I went into this was to say there are things that you can do in order to reduce child deaths. And my question really is, if indeed you think that a child's death is a bad thing, and nobody disagreed with that, and if you think that we are responsible for the things that we omit to do, at least some of them, as well as the things that we directly do, and most of you did think that, then it seems that we're responsible for those deaths, or at least the deaths of some of those children, even though we don't know which children they are, of course, but there are some children whose lives could be saved if we have some amounts of money that we could donate to highly effective organizations that would use that money to save children's lives, or of course adults' lives. I was just taking children as an example to parallel the case that I mentioned. Or it's not only saving lives that's important, giving people a better quality of life, basically a more dignified and decent kind of existence. So that's the kind of ethical issue that I wanted to raise. I think that's an ethical issue that faces anybody living in a developed country who is not, in economic terms, not near the bottom of that group. Of course there are, even in Britain, even more so in the United States, people who are still scraping to get by, who you would not expect to have a lot of spare cash perhaps to give. But for those who are more middle class or above, we all have spare money that we spend on things that we don't really need. We have money that we spend on all kinds of luxuries, from new clothing, or going to concerts, or going on vacations, or just things like having something to drink when you know, we don't need it to quench our thirst, and we've got water available without having to pay for it. So there's an ethical question that is raised there, a question about how we ought to live, and that's the question that I'm just taking as an example. One could, of course, also, as Naomi mentioned in introducing me, I have written about the moral status of animals and whether we're justified in using them as things to eat. That's another topic which also could raise some of these questions, but not the one that I've chosen today. Okay, so I'm just putting this slide up, is actually one that I made for some other lectures that I was giving last week at Yale. So these are people, not a comprehensive group, sort of chosen partly from people I know and from other contexts. These are people who have made choices to live more ethically, roughly in respect of the kind of issues that I've been talking about, although not only in that respect, and people on whom the idea of ethics, and very often actually formally taking courses in ethics, I'll come to that, has made a significant difference in the way they live. They're part of a group of people for whom the term now being used, this is sort of just kind of seems like things have informally gelled on using this term, although there were other terms floating around, known as effective altruists. Make a significant part of their life the idea of doing good to others, of helping others, of making the world a better place in some way. Not that they're all doing that 100% all the time, but some more, some less, but to a significant extent. And effective because they are not just doing this so that, you know, well, as long as my intentions are good, then that's fine. So, yeah, here's a charity that comes along, knocks on my door, rattles a tin under my nose, or catches my eye in an ad, so I'll give them some money. Rather, I really want to know that what I'm doing is doing not just some good, but the most good that I can do with the resources that I have available to me. And that's what this is all about. And there are, I think, some characteristic values that most of these people have, sort of overlapping consensus, not that all of them would share all of them. They definitely come from a variety of different philosophical points of view. They're not, they're sort of a mix of, I think a lot of these people have a secular basis for their ethics, but at least 3 of them on that slide, I think as far as I know, come from a Christian background that has led them to take that view. So there's no one underlying philosophical position, but they do have some common values which I will come to. So I'm going to start with these 2 guys who were the founders of GiveWell, who I was just telling you about, the rigorous charity evaluator. So in what way have they decided to be being altruistic and being effective? Well, they were working at a hedge fund in 2007. 2007, you might remember, was still sort of the really good years for hedge funds and stock exchange investors before things went a bit sour in the global financial crisis. So they were doing very well in this hedge fund. They were quite young. This is a recent photo, so they were 6 years younger even than they are there. They were quite young and they were earning a lot of money, more than they'd perhaps expected to earn at that age, and they thought, we don't need all this money, we should give some of it away. Not just these 2, but a few others at the particular organisation that they were working for. And then they said, yeah, good idea, so who will we give it to? And they formed a little group, and they said, well, you know, why don't you look at charities in this area, and you look at charities in this area, and you look at charities in that area, and let's pool our results and come back. Because they were the kind of people who are used to doing pretty systematic analysis of the things that they were working on. What they were working on was looking for good investments for their hedge fund. So they would go into these quite deeply to see what a company or investment proposal was all about, what it did, and they were used to getting facts and figures. So they contacted various charities, and guess what? They got nice glossy brochures showing smiling kids who'd benefited from the work of the charity. And when they rang the charity up and said, yeah, this is all very nice, but I'd really like to know how what your budget is, what you spend on this and that, how you evaluate the projects that you fund, and how you make decisions to fund this project rather than that one. And mostly they got, I'll get back to you. And people either didn't get back to them, or they didn't get back to them with the kinds of things that they needed. And so these two members of this group, Ellie Hassenfeld and Holden Karnofsky, decided that this really wasn't good enough. What they had discovered was a kind of a vacuum, because charity is a really big thing. I don't know what the figures are in Britain, but in the United States there's about $235 billion that is donated to charities each year. It's roughly 2% of gross national product. I think it's probably a little higher in the US as a percentage than it is in the UK, but that's partly because government covers things here that governments don't cover. For example, well, two things that people in the US give a lot to are firstly their religious institution, and they tend to be more attached to their religious institutions than people in Britain are. And secondly, giving to your university is very big, because there's a lot of people who've gone to private universities, and there's a tradition there of giving back to the university that educated you, whereas most people in Britain have not gone to private universities, and so they don't give. So that's a couple of reasons why it might be bigger. But anyway, it's a very big thing. And they thought, well, it's strange that there's all of this money going into this area without any really good data about whether it's working well or not. And so they saw a need to try and create that data and provide it. And so they left their hedge fund, and as this slide says, they took a very deep pay cut in order to do so. They founded an NGO. They paid themselves, or they set up a board. The board paid them, I guess, less than half of what they had been earning. But so that's the altruistic part of it, and the effective part of it is, of course, everything that they were doing was geared towards effectiveness. Holden Karnofsky has a blog that is on givewell.org, and if you're interested in pursuing this further, I do suggest you explore that website, because there was a lot of interesting ethical questions that come up. One of the things about this whole effective altruism movement is that it's really debating ethical questions that haven't really entered the academic mainstream. So there's a lot of this ongoing online discussion by people who are not professional philosophers, but which really does raise a lot of interesting issues. And here's a very recent blog from Holden, as you can see, from April the 4th this year, in which he decided to set out the values that he and the other people, there's a little group now at GiveWell, I don't know how big the staff is, I'm sure it's less than a dozen, but there's a little group of people working at GiveWell now doing this kind of research. And Holden tried to characterize the values that they generally have, and this is where some of these ethical questions come up, and where you can see how the kind of questions that are studied by philosophers in ethics actually relate to decisions that the GiveWell group are making and the decisions that other people are making. So the first point he makes is that they are, he used the term global humanitarians. I've put in the term cosmopolitan here because that's the term that tends to be used now in philosophy. That is, people who think that really we ought not just to focus on people in our own local community or even our own nation, but we ought to think globally. On Thursday of this week, I'm in Oxford and I'm taking part in a debate at the Oxford Union on the motion that this House would aid Britain before Burundi. So that is a debate about cosmopolitanism or global humanitarianism. Do you think that we have obligations to help people in Britain rather than people, obviously Burundi is chosen just because of the alliteration, people in developing countries where people are very poor, although of course people in Britain already have a level of social security, a level of healthcare, a level of sanitation, a level of safe drinking water, a level of free education that people in Burundi do not have. So cosmopolitans or global humanitarians will generally say, we ought to help people where we can help the most, where we can make the most difference, as against those who are communitarians or nationalists in this sense, who will say, no, we ought to help people in our own community. So the Give World people are global humanitarians, which is a position that I would also defend. The second premise is one that was basically what I was asking you. One that I was asking you in terms of, was it a bad thing that that child was hit by the van and died? Both the premature death and the suffering that I presume the child would experience, and of course the mother, presumably the father, experienced at the death of their child, that's a bad thing as well. And I think most of us would take that for granted. But we can certainly defend it if you want to when we get to question time. The third thing is something that's that other topic, I suppose. I think it's not only human suffering that matters, the suffering of animals matters as well. But I'm not going to defend that today. And how much was, this was really from Holden's points. So he said, in fact in the blog he elaborates that slightly, and he says there's some disagreement among us in the Give Well group as to how much it matters. So that's certainly something on which there's no community consensus, but there's significantly different views out there at the moment. But most people at least would accept that it matters somewhat. Though earlier in the Western tradition you can find plenty of philosophers, or theologians and philosophers, who say that it doesn't really matter at all. Now this next premise is much more controversial, and it's interesting that, that Holden comes out with this. So things that we talk about that we regard as being really important values, justice, equality and fairness, Holden says don't matter intrinsically. And really what he's taking here is, he doesn't explicitly say so, but it is the position that utilitarians would take. So utilitarians think that what really matters is the consequences of what you're doing. The right action is always the action that will have the best consequences for everyone affected over the longest possible term that you can reasonably contemplate. Everything else is subordinate to that. But that's not to deny that justice, equality and fairness may be important. It's just that they're not intrinsically important. They're important because by acting justly we produce a society in which we make people better off than they would have been if we acted unjustly. We promote equality essentially because egalitarian societies have less suffering, have people who are better off than societies that are inegalitarian. Fairness, similarly, is a basis on which people can cooperate freely and produces less strife and discord than societies that are unfair. That's the utilitarian position, and although that is certainly controversial, there are many people who think that all three of these are independently important values, and that even if something is not going to produce the best consequences, if it's the just thing to do, or the fair thing to do, or the thing that produces more equality, it's the thing we ought to do. That's something, again, I'll be happy to discuss if you want when we get to questions. And the last point is the consequentialist point. Now I've used the term utilitarian, and here is the term consequentialist. Let me just briefly set out what the difference is. The way philosophers use the term nowadays, consequentialism is the broader term. It's a term for a family of theories, of which what I said before is true. That is, consequentialists believe that the best action is the one that has the best consequences of all the alternative actions available to you. They usually use utilitarianism for a subset of those views. In particular, the subset that says the consequences you should look at are only consequences for the well-being or welfare or utility of beings affected by them. Usually the thing of conscious beings, so humans and non-human animals. And in the classical utilitarian tradition that goes back to Jeremy Bentham, they're talking about happiness and the absence of pain or suffering. So net happiness. That's the utilitarian view. The consequentialist might say, no, it's not only happiness or well-being that matters. It's also important that people have knowledge, let's say. Of course, utilitarians will say, yeah, well, knowledge is a good thing because knowledge is something that enables us to better understand how to produce more happiness. Look at things that are happening in the world and avoid bad consequences. Because we have knowledge of the effect of greenhouse gases on our climate, it gives us a chance to do something about it. So knowledge is valuable in all sorts of ways. But at least some consequentialists would say, no, knowledge is valuable even if it does not and never will have any impact on the well-being of anyone. So knowing the truth, they might say, is of value, even if knowing the truth just makes you miserable and even in the long run doesn't have good consequences for anyone. So that's the difference here. But although Holden uses the term consequentialist, I think in practice what they're talking about, the way they make their judgments of effectiveness, does seem to be utilitarian. Okay, so that's one example of the way in which values have led a couple of people to change what they do, to shift their way of living, and to find ways of doing significant amounts of good in the world. Let me tell you about another one who was on that original picture. This is someone a bit closer to you. Toby Ord is currently a research fellow in philosophy at Oxford. He was a graduate student there previously, and he founded this organisation, Giving What We Can. When he says, it occurred to him at some point, he calculated how much he was likely to earn over his lifetime, and just as an academic, he's not planning to go into finance or anything, how much he was likely to earn, and he calculated that that would be enough to prevent 80,000 people in developing countries from going blind. In developing countries, the most common cause of blindness is a condition called trachoma, which is carried by a microorganism that gets in your eyes. You can get it as a child. It slowly develops. It's actually quite irritating, but for many years it won't affect your vision, and gradually your eyeball will get scarred, you will start to have blurred vision, and by the time you're 30 or 40 you're quite likely to be blind. This can be detected and can be cured relatively cheaply, and Toby's calculation, as I say, was that with what he earned, still putting aside enough to live on for himself, because otherwise of course he's not going to keep earning, he could prevent 80,000 people going blind. So he's taken this particular pledge, and in Toby's case, though he had this particular thought, he is a philosopher who's interested in ethics. It's clear that it came out of philosophy for him. This is the website he set up, if you want to have a look at it, called Giving What We Can, which also does some research into the effectiveness of charities. And it encourages people to pledge to give not as much as he does, to give 10% of their income to charities relating to, that are aiming at the global poor. Okay, Alexander Berger, who's done something as well as giving away some money and working for GiveWell, he's done something that goes beyond that and that is more challenging. I admit I personally find it challenging because I still have 2 kidneys. But he was influenced by the view that there are people on waiting lists for kidneys who die because they don't get kidneys, and the chances that you will actually suffer by donating a kidney, I mean suffer beyond the week or two that it may take to recover from the operation, which is not serious or very severe or very risky operation, the chances that you will die because you only have one kidney have been calculated as being about 1 in 4,000. Now, I'm not going to vouch for those figures. Some people have told me that might be somewhat less than that, but it's not very great. And the reason for that is, while certainly people do get kidney disease, if you get kidney disease, it's likely to affect both your kidneys. The circumstances in which you would die had you had 2 kidneys would be something like if you have an accident that injures one side of you and destroys the kidney on one side, and that was the side of your remaining kidney. So, personally, I find it admirable, while not being quite prepared to go there myself, but I'm not sure that I can defend or justify the fact that I haven't gone there myself. So it's one of those areas where no matter how committed you are to living ethically, and I think I'm reasonably committed to that, there may come a point, and then you have to decide what do you think about yourself here. How do you feel? How does this affect your self-esteem and your vision of yourself? So Alexander is one of those, and here's somebody who I didn't know at all, but he wrote to me by email just as I was preparing the lectures that I was giving at Yale last week. Chris Croy, who's an American, actually photographed as he was recovering from his surgery, has also donated a kidney to a stranger. He's also changed his diet as a basis of ethics, and he's still a student, but he's planning to donate some of his income as well after he graduates. And in Chris's case, I think also in Alexander's, from things that he said, courses that they took in ethics were clearly influential. In fact, for Chris wrote to me saying that it all began in an ethics course that he was taking in the US. Read some of my work about altruism, about global poverty, and started discussing the kidney issue, and decided to go ahead and act on it. So, if you're taking an ethics course, beware, it can have dramatic effects. But personally, I find that fulfilling, that it does have dramatic effects, of course. If ethics were only, as it seemed to be when I was an undergraduate back in the mid-60s, ethics as it was done here, dominated by Oxford linguistic analysis was the sort of current way of doing ethics at the time, did seem to be neutral in terms of content. It didn't seem to really make any difference. It wasn't really supposed to make any difference to the way that you live. And I think things have changed. Perhaps gone back to an earlier ethical tradition. Okay, just a couple more of these. Will McCaskill, as he's now called, used to be called Will Crouch, but he and his fiancée decided to have a common name, but not either of their name. A sort of non-sexist way of having the same name for a couple. Is another part of the Oxford philosophy group, still a grad student. After working with Toby on Giving What We Can, he founded another website called 80,000 Hours. 80,000 hours is the number of hours that Will calculated most of us spend in our working lives, in other words, our careers. So he thought that in addition to questions about, should you give money away, should you give it, to whom should you give it, he thought it's very important to think, what are you going to do as a career? At least for those of you who are a lot younger than I am, I guess, and making choices or have choices ahead of you about your career. You can perhaps do more good through your career choice than through anything else that you do. So he set up this website, 80,000 Hours, about how you best make a difference in the world. Now, probably what you will be thinking is, well, he's going to tell us that we should become aid workers, let's say. We should get jobs with Oxfam or some other Doctors Without Borders. Perhaps indeed we should become doctors and then work for Doctors Without Borders, because we can do good and save lives there. He's not saying that you won't do good if you do that. But he also is suggesting a quite different and initially surprising thought. And the idea is this. Suppose that you do apply to Oxfam for a job. Suppose Oxfam has a job for an aid worker. And you apply to that job and you get that job. What difference have you made by getting that job? Well, you can't say that all of the good that Oxfam aid worker does only exists because of you. Because if you hadn't got that job, there would have been other applicants for that job. Obviously Oxfam thought you were the best, but the margin between you and the next best applicant is probably not so great. So all that you can say you're really contributing is whatever that margin is, the small amount that you can do because you're slightly better qualified, more talented for the job than the next person trying to get the job. The real limitation for the amount of good that Oxfam or other groups can do is how many jobs do they have? And that depends on how much money do they have. So here's a different idea. Don't become an aid worker, become a banker or a corporate lawyer. You can earn heaps of money in a few years. You can donate that money to Oxfam. Depending how successful you are in this career, maybe Oxfam can create 5 new positions for aid workers because of the amount that you've donated. It's not unrealistic. The ratio of a successful investment banker or corporate lawyer to the costs of employing an aid worker might be 5 to 1. It might be 10 to 1, depending on how successful you are. So in that case, it's not the case that if you hadn't been the investment banker, then the next best investment banker would have done as much good as you, because we know that most investment bankers are not heavy donors to Oxfam. So the money wouldn't have flown to Oxfam or whatever other charity you think is most effective, and therefore all of that good that your donation to Oxfam does is attributable to you, would not have happened without you in the way that it wouldn't with the aid worker. And you know, that seems, to some people that seems bizarre. They sort of say, well, you know, how could you become an investment banker if really what you're interested in is doing good in the world? You know, you wouldn't, your heart wouldn't be in it, they'd say, so you wouldn't be successful at it. Or other people say, you'd end up getting corrupted by the culture of investment bankers. You'd say, well, I did intend to give away a lot of money, but, you know, really I need that big house in the suburbs with a lawn, and I really need a BMW to drive around in, and whatever else it might be, and you end up not giving. So that's possible, but this is not just telling stories. There are people who are doing this. Here's one of them. He was a student of mine at Princeton, Matt Wager. Got the prize for the best undergraduate thesis in philosophy in the year he graduated, which was just a year or so ago. He was an able philosophy student, could have gone on in philosophy, would have been accepted by some of the best graduate schools available, and very probably kept at it, worked hard, would have had an academic career if he wanted to do that. But he decided instead to go into finance in New York, and he's already able to give $100,000, so he hasn't been corrupted so far. Admittedly, the experiment hasn't gone on very long yet, but he's already able to give $100,000 this year to the top-rated charities of GiveWell. Okay, I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to say a little bit about some of the underlying things here that relate to philosophy, going more deeply into philosophy. So, David Hume, a great perhaps one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and certainly in the British tradition, in the 18th century, denied that reason has a role in ethics. This famous little quote here, he said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." I should say that by passions here, Hume meant, in this 18th century usage, not only things that you get really worked up about, as when people say, I'm just so passionate about this, or when they say he acted in the heat of the passions, but rather what we would refer to as desires or inclinations. So for Hume you could have calm passions. When you sit down calmly and you think about what you most want, that's still a passion. So he didn't mean that you should just act out of inflamed emotions, but he did mean that reason is secondary to desires. That we start with desires which are non-rational, do not have a basis in themselves in reason, and then reason is instrumental in telling us how to satisfy our desires. Sometimes our desires will conflict. We have to work out which desire is the stronger one, but reason will help us to get wherever we want to. Now, on that view, you would have to say that these people that I've shown you had this kind of passion, a calm passion maybe, to do good in the world. Which is not impossible. I'm not saying necessarily that that's wrong, that they had empathy with the suffering of others, with the global poor, for example, and they wanted to reduce that. That would be how a Humean would explain what they would do, but would then say that although it's nice that they've made those decisions, we may admire those decisions, there's nothing irrational about acting completely differently. So that's one view. But there's a different view. Someone like, for the students here I'm going to be talking about tomorrow, the 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick thought that there is a rational basis for acting ethically. He thought that in rational beings as such, once you judge that something is what you ought to do, this gives you a motive to action. Now, Sidgwick didn't think that we are rational beings as such. That is, he didn't think we're purely rational. He goes on to say, although in human beings this is only one motive among others which are liable to conflict with it, and is not always, perhaps not usually, a predominant motive. So he acknowledges as a matter of psychological fact that we don't always act out of the perception of something being what we ought to do. But he does think that it's possible for us to do so. It is one motive for rational beings. So he's disagreeing with Hume to that extent, saying that reason has a larger role to play in ethics than Hume did. And he actually talked about some things that he thought were rational or self-evident axioms. I'll be talking more about this tomorrow. For example, that the good of one individual is of no more importance from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe than the good of any other. So this is the cosmopolitanism or the global humanitarianism that I was talking about. And as a rational being, he says, it's evident that I'm bound to aim at good generally. So to do the maximum amount of good, insofar as I'm a rational being, not merely a particular part of it. Again, that's the cosmopolitanism. And that takes him to this third idea, that we're bound to regard the good of any other individual as much as our own, except insofar as we judge it to be less when impartially viewed, or less certainly knowable or attainable. So going back to these questions about helping the global poor on the other side of the world, Sidgwick probably would have thought in his day, we ought not really to try to do that. He said we ought to really focus on those closest to us. But that's because what was good for people on the other side of the world in Sidgwick's day was not certainly knowable or attainable by us. That is, we didn't really know what was good for them. It took a long time for communications, and even if we did know, it would be hard for us to really make a lot of difference. So Sidgwick thought. You could debate that. The 19th century historians among you, late 19th century historians, could debate whether that was true or not. But it's certainly true today that we have much greater knowledge, not perfect knowledge, but much greater knowledge of where there is a need for assistance, and we have much greater ability to provide it. So that's an important difference which affects the application of this global humanitarianism or cosmopolitanism that Sidgwick was defending. Okay, finishing at that point, and we still have about 25 minutes for questions. Thank you.